Hello everyone, and welcome back to our series on the patriarchs, where we look at the men in Genesis that God dealt with and moved them along through a process of growing closer to Him, giving them opportunities to overcome failures in their life, difficulties that they faced. God was faithful throughout those times to help these men attempt to overcome these problems. We've seen already two different men, Abraham and Lot, and how Abraham took advantage of the opportunity that God gave him, overcame his failure of weak faith, and became the father of many nations, a man known as the father of faith. On the other hand, we saw Lot, who was entangled with sin, and God gave him multiple chances to overcome that problem and to attempt to help him come out of that entanglement, yet Lot never broke free. He never did what it took to come out of that. We're going to look at our third man today, and that is Isaac. Isaac was Abraham's son, and he is an example of one of those people who never fully commits to God. And that may sound strange because we often talk about God being the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Isaac is named in that. But Isaac did not live up to the same level of devotion to God that Abraham had, or that his son Jacob or grandson Joseph had, as we'll see going through. So Isaac stands again as an example for us of what not to do, how not to interact with God. We've seen Isaac already as we talked about the story of Abraham, that Isaac was that child of promise, the one that God had told Abraham he would have with Sarah. We saw how Abraham ensured that Isaac had a wife who would believe in God. He sent his servant to go find Rebekah and bring her back to be Isaac's wife so that Isaac would have a woman who was a person of faith. Isaac seemed to have everything already set up. It was ready to go in his life, that everything was teed up for him to just go forward in life as a person walking hand in hand with God, having a great relationship. But we can see as we read and study all of Isaac in these next few chapters we'll talk about today, that having a relationship with God is a decision or a choice that each person must individually make. And this brings us to Isaac's failure. What is the issue that Isaac has problems with? It is what we might say trying to live off of daddy's blessings, trying to live off of someone else's relationship with God. Isaac was the son of Abraham. Abraham became a man of great faith, walking as a friend of God. Yet that was Abraham, not Isaac. As we look through Genesis, we see God blessing Isaac as a result of Abraham's relationship, but we don't see Isaac developing his own relationship with God. For the first several years of Isaac's life, as we see in Genesis, we find him with Abraham. We see him as Abraham's son. But in Genesis chapter 25, Abraham dies. And now it's time for Isaac to step up, to be the patriarch, the one that is the head of this household, leading the whole family as the priest of that home. But when we see in chapters 25 and 26 of Genesis, at the start of Isaac's solo life, so to speak, we find God's blessings on Isaac tied back to Abraham. Three different places it talks about that. In Genesis 25:11, it says, "And it came to pass after the death of Abraham that God blessed his son Isaac." Blessed his son Isaac. We see Isaac referred back to being Abraham's son and God's blessing there. In Genesis 26, verses 4 and 5, it's God talking directly to Isaac. He says, "I will make your seed multiply like the stars of heaven, and I will give unto your seed all of these countries, and in your seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws." We see here the blessing that God promises to go on to Isaac and his descendants is because of Abraham's relationship. And if we go on to verse 24, again God speaking to Isaac, it says, the Lord appeared unto him the same night and said, I am the God of Abraham, your father. Do not fear, for I am with you and will bless you and multiply your seed for my servant Abraham's sake. So what we see is as Isaac starts off, yes, he has God's blessing. Yes, he has benefits in his life. He has wealth and he has position. But it is due to Abraham and the blessings that Abraham worked with God to achieve are being passed down to Isaac. But we don't see Isaac gaining blessings of his own. He's simply riding Abraham's coattails. As we read through, you'll find Isaac does not seem to have the same level of relationship with God that Abraham had. When we see, yes, Abraham had mistakes and he messed up, but we constantly see Abraham building altars and making sacrifices and praying for people and being in relationship with God. Instead, we don't see Isaac hardly doing any of that. One time in all of Scripture, we see Isaac build an altar. Once. The farther we get from Abraham's death, the less we see about this relationship. And we'll talk more about that in a second. But I want us to even point out one time, it was Genesis 26 and verse 25, that we see Isaac build an altar. It's the only time he does it. This is a man who, as a young man or a child, was laid on an altar by Abraham, who was shown how to live in relationship to God, who participated in Abraham's greatest experience of faith as the sacrifice that Abraham was going to make and seeing God provide the ram as an alternate. Isaac saw the intervention of God in Abraham's life. So there should be no reason for him to lack an understanding of how to be in relationship with God. Yet while Abraham builds multiple altars, and later on we'll see Jacob build multiple altars and communicate and commune with God, we only see Isaac do it this one time. It's only once that he makes an attempt to worship God properly. He seems to just be riding Abraham's coattails. And as we said, the farther we get from Abraham's death, the less we see reference to the blessings of God on Isaac's life. And in fact, for the last 80 years of Isaac's life, the blessings of God are not mentioned at all. Here at the beginning, and at this time, Isaac is in his 40s, 50s, 60s in Genesis 25 and 26, we see discussion of the blessings and God promising to extend the blessings to Isaac and his seed because of Abraham's faithfulness. But once we get farther into the story, as I said, for the last 80 years of Isaac's life, there's no mention of God's blessings at all. So that becomes a problem. Not only is he trying to live off daddy's blessings, but he never takes personal responsibility for living in covenant with God. He tries to live off of Abraham's faith. He doesn't create a faith of his own. And we can stop there and compare to modern Christianity and how many people are living off of grandma's faith or grandpa's faith or mama's faith or daddy's faith, and they're not developing a faith of their own. Yes, there may be blessings in their life. They may have benefits that followed from their ancestors' relationship with God, but there's no growth of that. And just like Isaac, we don't see the blessings of God described for the last part of his life because he did not maintain the covenant. He did not maintain the relationship. People who are trying to live off of an ancestor's relationship with God may start off with blessings and benefits, but without maintaining that relationship, you don't maintain the benefits of that relationship either. When we don't have the relationship with God, it means we're going to fall into bad patterns of behavior. And just like Isaac tries to pull in the benefits of God from Abraham's history, we also see him pulling in bad behaviors from Abraham's history. He doesn't build the relationship with God, but he ends up taking on the negative aspects of Abraham. By relying on his father's reputation, he falls into the same patterns of bad behavior that Abraham had. Well, what am I talking about? When we remember Abraham's story, we remember how he lied about his wife Sarah and said she was his sister. Did that twice because he was afraid that they would kill him to take her. We also saw how Abraham originally did not trust God to remain in Canaan, but he left and went to Egypt in a time of famine. Isaac faces these same trials, these same difficulties. In Genesis 26, starting in verse 1, it says, "There was a famine in the land, beside the first famine that was in the days of Abraham. And Isaac went unto Abimelech, king of the Philistines, unto Gerar. But the Lord appeared to him and said, Do not go down into Egypt, dwell in the land which I will tell you of, and sojourn in this land, and I will be with you." Because of Abraham's faithfulness, God warns Isaac and warns him not to go to Egypt, but he does go to Gerar. Now, remember, Gerar was in the land of Canaan, and they were people who did believe in God. But Abraham had already created conflict with them by his lying about Sarah. And now Isaac is going there as well because of the famine. Now, I do want to point out that this Abimelech is probably not the same one that was in the days of Abraham. This was most likely a family name or name of the kings that got passed down. Just like, say, over in England, there have been 8 King Henrys and several King Williams and Edwards, and that name gets reused. Well, it's the same way here, that the king of Gerar, this Abimelech, is probably a son or grandson of the one that Abraham dealt with. We don't know for sure, but it is most likely. Regardless, Isaac goes to Gerar, to King Abimelech, and wants to live there during this time of famine. Well, that's exactly what Abraham dealt with. But Isaac continues the mistakes that Abraham made. If we read on in verse 6, it says, "And Isaac dwelt in Gerar, and the men of the place asked him about his wife, and he said, She is my sister. For he was afraid to say, She is my wife, lest, he said, the men of the place should kill me for Rebekah, because she was fair to look upon." So just like his father, Isaac tells Abimelech that his wife is his sister. He starts following Abraham's bad behaviors. He falls into the problems. If we don't have a relationship with God, then the problems that our ancestors overcame will become our problems yet again. We have to maintain the relationship with God that helped them overcome the problems if we want to avoid those problems ourselves. Our ancestors may have fought through many difficulties in their lives and overcome them with the help of God. And if we want to maintain those blessings, then we have to maintain the relationship that was developed so that we can avoid those same problems. Isaac doesn't do that. He does not have the relationship with God that Abraham had, so he falls into the same problems. And like Abraham, he gets caught in the lie. If we read on in verse 8, it said, "And it came to pass, when he had been there a long time, that Abimelech, the king of the Philistines, looked out of his window and saw, and behold, Isaac was sporting with Rebekah his wife. And Abimelech called Isaac and said, Behold, surely she is your wife. And how did you say to me, She is my sister? And Isaac said to him, Because I said, Unless I would die for her. And Abimelech said, What have you done to us? One of the people might lightly have lain with your wife, and you should have brought guiltiness upon us. And Abimelech charged all his people, saying, He that touches this man or his wife will be put to death." So we see the same problem. Now, this is a true lie, because Sarah was Abraham's half-sister. Rebekah is just Isaac's cousin. And so this is a complete lie that he takes on out of fear. He does not have the relationship with God to believe that God will protect him and his wife. And instead, he makes a lie rather than trusting God to protect him. And Isaac gets caught in this lie when Abimelech sees him having sex with Rebekah. And the result of that conflict, just like with the result of that lie, just like the result was with Abraham, the result is conflict. That now, instead of living in peace with Abimelech and the people of Gerar, Isaac is in conflict. You know, we read the passage just now where Abimelech calls Isaac in and fusses at him and says, look, you cause problems. Somebody might have taken Rebekah and not thought anything about it, and you would have brought guiltiness upon us in the eyes of God. So there's already a strained relationship. There's probably some strain already from the history of Abraham's relationship with these people, and now Isaac's making it worse. And if we read the rest of chapter 26, and I'm not going to read it all because it's very lengthy, but in the rest of chapter 26, we see Isaac and the men of Gerar in constant conflict over wells. Remember, we're in a very dry area of the world. There's not a lot of water source, and so wells were very important, especially for people who were herdsmen. And Isaac had a lot of herds and flocks that needed to be watered. And so he and the men of Gerar end up in conflict over these wells. And that's in Genesis 26, verses 17 through 33. And Isaac will dig a well. He and his men and his household will dig a well, and the people of Gerar will come and take it, and they'll fight over it, until eventually they have to make a covenant with Abimelech, which is basically a treaty of, we will not fight over these wells, because if we do, we're going to end up killing each other. And they make an agreement and an oath that they will leave each other alone and they will separate. So now once again, Isaac is having to leave a place where there was water and was supply, just like Abraham had to leave this area, because of a lack of faith and a lack of trust. The same issues, the same problems that Abraham dealt with. So we see further evidence of how Isaac did not have a relationship with God, the relationship that Abraham had, in that Isaac does not do for his son what Abraham did for him in ensuring that he has a believing wife. Remember, Abraham sent his servant to go find Rebekah, to find a woman who believed in God and bring her back to be Isaac's wife, so that Isaac was joined with a partner who would support him in his faith. And we see that Isaac does not do that for his own children. In Genesis 26, verse 34, it says, and Esau, who was one of Isaac's two children, he had twin boys, and Esau was 40 years old when he took to wife Judith, the daughter of Beeri the Hittite, and Bashemath, the daughter of Elon the Hittite, which were a grief of mind unto Isaac and to Rebekah. Esau marries pagan women, women who did not believe in God, women who followed other gods. And it says they were a grief of mind to Isaac, that this is a problem. Well, Isaac could have taken the step that his father had done and ensured a believing wife. But when we don't have a relationship with God, then we're not thinking about the things of God on a regular basis. We're not planning our life and orchestrating our life in line with the will of God, so we miss these opportunities. And just as Esau went ahead and got two wives who were foreign and pagan wives without considering the spiritual aspect of that marriage, Isaac did not ensure that. Obviously, he has not worked on passing down the faith that Abraham showed him. He's not passing that down to his sons. He's not ensuring believing spouses for his sons. He's just kind of going through life and letting things happen as they will. If we want the blessings of God to continue, if we want to see our blessings passed down to the next generation, then we must live in relationship with God. We must develop that relationship so that our children see that relationship within us, and so that we develop the relationship we've seen in our ancestors. Or if we haven't seen it in our ancestors, we start that relationship with God that we can then pass on to others. But Esau marries heathen women, and Isaac doesn't do anything to change that. And it's actually after this point when conflict has arisen with Abimelech, and now conflict within his family as Esau's wives become a grief to him. It's from this point on that we no longer read about the blessings of God in Isaac's life. In chapter 25 and chapter 26, we see where God blessed Isaac. We also see the only time that Isaac built an altar. Yet after this, after there's conflict and after there is dissension within the house, we no longer see the blessings of God. The benefits that come from the relationship our ancestors had with God only last so long. They will run out. But when we maintain a relationship with God, His blessings and His mercies are new every morning. His grace continues, and we have that barrel of meal that will never run dry. We can go to the throne of grace and receive help in time. When we have relationship, then those things are possible. But when we're trying to live off the blessings of our ancestors' relationship with God, those blessings will run out. And we see them no longer mentioned in Genesis in reference to Isaac. In fact, rather than the blessings of God being in Isaac's life, we start seeing more and more about conflict in his life. Not just conflict with Abimelech and with outsiders, the people of Gerar. We start to see conflict within the family, and that conflict grows and grows, not just with Esau and his wives, but between Isaac's sons, Esau and Jacob. What brings this to a head is the fact that Isaac and Rebekah play favorites between their sons. They had twin sons, Jacob and Esau. And Esau was actually born first, with Jacob grabbing a hold of the heel of Esau's foot. And in this culture, the firstborn was entitled to an extra share of the inheritance. And beyond that, the firstborn was considered the heir of the relationship with God, the heir of the promise that God had given. So the promise that God gave Abraham about the land of Canaan and blessing them and multiplying his descendants, that was passed down to Isaac, the child of promise that God gave to Abraham. It should go down to Esau as the oldest child. But we see in chapter 27, again, I'm not going to read a lot tonight because there's a lot to see here. We see at the start, earlier on actually, we start to see some of this conflict happen in Genesis chapter 25, when Esau comes in tired and hungry and sells his birthright to Jacob for a pot of stew. And Jacob sees no problem with creating this very uneven bargain and taking Esau's birthright. Another place the Bible says that Esau despised his birthright, that he did not treat it for the value that it was. Remember, this birthright is not just extra inheritance. It is inheriting the relationship with God, the promises of God, the covenant that God has made with this family. And Esau did not treat that as something worth having. And he passed it on to Jacob for just a bowl of stew. And that brings about conflict within the brothers, because after he gets over being tired and hungry, Esau realizes what he's done and how Jacob deceived him, and becomes angry with Jacob and upset with him. Notice how in that passage, if we were to read it in Genesis 25, verses 29 through 34, we don't see Isaac involved at all. This is a dispute between the brothers that Isaac does not mediate. He allows it to happen. He has not taught them how to respect the things of God. So it's really no surprise that Esau despises the birthright that is the relationship with God, the special relationship that was to be passed down through the generations. So there's conflict already between the boys dating back to this time. But as we get to chapter 27, we start to see how that conflict between the boys is made worse or exacerbated by the parents playing favorites between them. Isaac favors Esau, and Rebekah favors Jacob. In chapter 27, we find that not only does Jacob, having already taken the birthright from Esau, he now steals the blessing. Now, to us, that doesn't seem like much to say, oh, it's just a blessing. But in this time period, the blessing was a very sacred and important rite or ritual. It was something that, as a father was ready to step back and possibly die, or what we would call retire from leadership of the family, then a blessing would be proclaimed over one of the children, typically the oldest. And that blessing was a passing of the responsibility, a passing of the headship of the family. And so, as I said, it should go originally to Esau. Having sold his birthright to Jacob, by law it should now go to Jacob. But Isaac, favoring Esau, wants to bless Esau instead. And Isaac likes this particular type of food that Esau makes out of venison, and he asks him to go and get it. Rebekah overhears it and wants her favorite, Jacob, to get it instead. So she has Jacob kill a lamb or a goat and put the hair on his skins and pretend to be Esau and trick his father into giving him the blessing. Now, what that was, again, was a formal announcement and pronouncement of Jacob's headship of the family. Isaac is saying, I'm stepping down, I'm about to die, I want to pass this off to the next generation, and the one that he blessed would be the one that became the head of that family. And because of Rebekah and Jacob's scheming, Isaac blesses Jacob instead of Esau. And in doing so, he formally makes Jacob the head of the family and the one to receive the blessings and the inheritance of the special relationship with God that God had proclaimed over Abraham and passed down to Isaac. So we see this deception that comes in. Well, when they find out what has happened, it makes this conflict between the boys boil over. And Esau says, I am going to kill my brother over this. And Jacob has to flee for his life. And he flees to his uncle's house, away, the uncle where his mother's brother in Padan Aram, and flees for his life. So what happens as a result of the conflict and the lack of treating spiritual things with reverence, the result of that is Isaac loses his son Jacob. Jacob has to go away and flee. And for many, many years, Isaac does not see Jacob. And Jacob is gone from his life. So when we don't live in relationship with God, when we don't maintain the spiritual things of our life, then conflict arises that will cause loss, it will cause devastation, it will cause conflict, and trouble follows throughout all of those things. And we see that here demonstrated as Isaac loses his son and has a strained relationship with the remaining son and with his wife because of all of these things going on. Whereas if Isaac had instead lived in relationship with God, built altars, ensured righteous wives for his sons, maintained the special relationship, and done all the work to demonstrate how to live in relationship with God, it is possible that this conflict would not have arisen and Jacob and Esau would have lived together in harmony. Now, it may have, may not have. We can't say for sure, but it's definitely more of a possibility than living outside of the relationship of God and not showing these boys how to follow God appropriately. Now, I will say in all of this, God does remain faithful. And that God does carry down the promises that he made to Abraham through Isaac. He does pass them on down to Jacob, despite Isaac's failure to live up to the covenant. In Genesis chapter 28 and verse 13, God appears to Jacob and says, "Behold, the Lord stood above the ladder that Jacob dreamed of, and said, I am the Lord God of Abraham your father, and the God of Isaac. The land where you lie on, to you I will give it, and to your seed, and your seed shall be as the dust of the earth, and you will spread abroad to the west and the east and the north and the south, and in you and in your seed shall all families of the earth be blessed. And behold, I am with you, and will keep you in all places wherever you go, and will bring you again to this land, for I will not leave you until I have done what I have spoken to you of." So we see here the promise that God makes to Jacob, that I will pass this down to you, that you have inherited this special covenant relationship that I made with Isaac. It has passed through your father, and now it's yours. It's important to note that God confirms this as soon as Isaac has passed off that blessing. Isaac proclaims the blessing over Jacob. The conflict causes Jacob to flee, and that night when he flees is when the passage I just read happens. That God tells Jacob, you now have this relationship, this covenant promise. So when we really consider all of that, what we see is Isaac didn't take hold of the promise, truly grasp it when it was passed down from Abraham, and now he's passed it off very quickly to his son. Isaac is not living with the promise, he has just passed it on to the next generation. He's become a carrier of the promise rather than a recipient of the promise. So even because Isaac did not live up to it, God remains faithful. God passes it on to Jacob. Now, as for Isaac himself, it's important to notice that God is faithful to Isaac by giving him two opportunities to live in covenant with him. God appears to Isaac twice and proclaims to him, look, I am the God of your father Abraham. If you will live in relationship with me, then I will bless you, and all these things will happen for you. But Isaac never gives more than a half-hearted response. The first time Isaac doesn't go to Egypt, he does obey what God said, but he goes to Abimelech instead and gets in trouble there. The second time, he does build an altar. It's the one time he builds an altar, but then he doesn't go on to show his sons what that altar is all about. He doesn't go on to show his sons how to live in relationship. And the conflict that results in that takes over his life to the point that he just passes on the covenant of God. He doesn't seem to grasp the riches, the blessings, the power that would come from walking with God on his own behalf, instead of just relying on inheriting that from Abraham. So what we see when we got to chapter 27, where Jacob deceives him, where Isaac says to Esau, go hunt for me and make this savory meat that I like so much, and then I will bless you, and then Jacob steals the blessing. It's important to note that at that time, if we read the first verse of 27, it says, it came to pass that when Isaac was old and his eyes were dim so that he could not see, he called Esau his eldest son, and he said to him, my son. And Esau said, behold, here I am. And Isaac said, behold, now I am old, and I do not know the day of my death. If we skip down, it says, verse 4, make me savory meat, such as I love, and bring it to me that I may eat, that my soul may bless you before I die. Okay, he's saying he's old, that he's not going to make it, and he wants to do this. That seems like wisdom, right? And Isaac is, at this point, 137 years old. To us, that seems very, very old. But remember, in the book of Genesis, people live much longer. In fact, Abraham died at the age of 175. So Isaac seems to believe that God is not going to keep him around like he kept his father Abraham. He doesn't seem like he will live out to that ripe old age that God gave to Abraham. Instead, at 137, he lies on his bed and he says, I'm old and I'm about to die and I just want to pass it on and be done with it. He's giving up on the relationship with God. We should never give up on the relationship with God. We should never want to get rid of it or pass it on. But Isaac does this. He says he's soon going to die, and as a result, he starts trying to give away the blessings of God. How often do we make excuses for why we won't live in relationship with God, and rather than do the work, and it is work, but rather than do the work necessary to live in the relationship with God and receive the blessings of God, we will just give those blessings away. We'll let somebody else have it. It might be our son, daughter, might be some other relative, might be somebody we don't even know. We're just, God, I'm not going to do the work necessary to live in relationship with you. That's basically what Isaac is saying. He's saying, I'm old, I can't see, I'm tired, I'm done with this, and I'm going to pass off this blessing. He says, I don't know when I'm going to die, I'm too old. He actually lived 43 more years. And in those 43 years, he no longer had the blessings of God because he gave them up and he passed them on to Jacob. We don't know when our death date is. We don't know when we're going to die, but we also don't know when God's done with us. And I would argue he's not done with us until we go on to glory. So we don't need to pass on those blessings. We need to live out the relationship with God. Live in the blessings until it is time for us to go to our reward. But Isaac doesn't want to do that. He passes it on. He gives it away to his sons rather than trusting God to bring those blessings for himself. So as I said, Isaac actually lives 43 more years, and he's 180 when he dies. He's older than Abraham was. Yet he did not have the faith that God would give him those years. I argue he did not have the faith because he did not develop a relationship with God. And those 43 years are filled with conflict with Rebekah over the deception. He's lost Jacob. His other sons married into an idolatrous family. He's got all these problems because he refused to give God the effort and the relationship that God deserved. And as a result, conflict entered his life, problems entered his life, loss entered his life. We have to understand that the true blessings of God only come to us when we live in relationship with God. We can't rely on the blessings that come from our ancestors. Yes, Mama may have been a great saint. Grandma might have prayed every night. Granddaddy might have been a man who was devoted to his church and his God and doing everything, but that was them. What about you? You can't live off of somebody else's faith. In the New Testament, these people start trying to cast out demons in the name of Jesus, whom Paul preaches. They didn't have a relationship with Jesus. They just said, this Paul guy's doing this stuff, so I'm going to try it too. The demons beat them up and said, Jesus I know and Paul I know, but who are you? When we don't have a relationship with God, that's what the devil says. It's like, look, I know all these other people. I know your mama. I know your grandma. They prayed against me all the time. But who are you? How are we living? Are we living a relationship where the devil knows our name? Are we living a relationship where the devil's afraid of our connection with God? Are we living a relationship where the blessings of God continually flow into our life because of our obedience, because of our connection to God? Not because we've inherited some physical or tangible things from our fathers, grandfathers, other ancestors. Are we receiving the mercies of God that are new every day because of our relationship with Him? If we want those true blessings of God, we have to walk in relationship. We can't rely on anyone else to gain God's favor for us. Now, it is interesting if we look through all of what we're going to study in this passage of the four heirs to the covenant that we find in Genesis. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. Those were the ones that this covenant relationship got passed down through. All four of them had the opportunity to make that connection with God. 3 of the 4 did. Isaac did not. And Isaac is the only one of the 4 who does not receive an individual blessing from God. He's the only one who doesn't live in relationship with God, and he's the only one who doesn't receive an individual blessing, not an inherited blessing. Something for us to understand, that if we want the benefits, and there are so many benefits of living in relationship with God, then we have to do just that. We have to live in relationship with God. Is it work? Does it require stuff of us? Yes. But the benefits are so worth it. Not just in this life, but in the life eternal. So I hope what we can learn from studying Isaac today is that we can't live off of daddy's blessings or grandma's blessings or whoever else. We cannot live off of someone else's relationship with God. We have to have our own. And sadly, that is the story we see with Isaac. Not a man who goes off and lives in sin and does terrible things, but just a man who lets what could be slip through his fingers. Lets the possibility of a deep and powerful relationship in covenant with God just be passed on to the next generation and doesn't receive that for himself. I pray that we are not those people, that we will do what it takes to live in relationship with God. We will make up our mind to do what God requires of us so that we have that connection with him, so that we receive the blessings ourselves, and so that we grow the relationship before we pass it on to the next generation. We should be passing it on, but we should be building that relationship before we do. As we come back next week to the next part of our series, we will look at Jacob. The one we saw today that Isaac did pass the relationship on to. We will look at Jacob's life and how he has a fault and a failure that God helps him overcome. It'll take us a couple of weeks to get through Jacob, and then we'll finish up with Joseph as we look at these men. Now, fortunately, Jacob and Joseph do take advantage of the opportunity that God gives them, and they do overcome the failure within their life. The past couple of men we've seen didn't. Lot and Isaac both grasped hold of the opportunities God gave them. But thankfully Joseph and Jacob do, and we'll see that in the next couple of weeks. So thank you for being with us tonight. Hope you will continue this series with us as we go forward in future weeks.